anyway, like I said, Wednesday I went through a lot of material, and I don't think I should have done that, but because in doing so, I neglected to really pay attention to what I was saying, and I think some things did not come across the way they should have, and I don't think that was done in a very good way. However, it did kind of give you a little bit of an idea of the interaction of genealogy and prophecy. Today, we're going to look at the last two things that the author of the book gives us as far as the genealogy, and that is the reference to the stump of David, or the branch, or the, what he calls it, a stump, and the son of David. So we will look at that. We'll look at the line of Jesse and David as it relates to the prophecies. And then I want to take a kind of a detailed look at 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 12 through 16. This is a passage that can be kind of problematic in a way, because when we look at it, we can see the Messianic elements within it, but excuse me. But at the same time, we see the statement that God says that he will be my son, and if he falls off or goes astray, that he will be punished. And so how does that apply to the Messiah, if indeed it does? Getting a little choked up here a little bit. Anyway, then we'll look at towards the end of the lesson, I'd like to give us some time to look at some clarification of what we talked about. So the prophecy or the line of Jesse. Isaiah chapter 11 verse 1 and Isaiah 11 verse 10. It says, "And then a shoot will spring from the stem of Jesse, and a branch from his roots will bear fruit." In verse 10 he says, "Then in that day the nations will resort to the root of Jesse, who will stand as a signal for the peoples, and the resting place will be glorious." So we see that the Messiah is being referred to as the root of Jesse. And I think that is significant in itself, and as we'll see here in just a moment, the importance of it. From the context of Isaiah, as the author of our book says, he had just foretold the humbling of the mighty nation of Assyria. They were overthrown, conquered as a nation. And when we look at this, and I keep telling myself, you know, nations rise to be world conquerors. They can be the most powerful nation in the world, and yet God will bring them down. So whenever we live as a society, we should accept the fact that eventually one day our society will, as we are now a powerful nation within the realms of this world, we could very easily be brought down, just as Assyria was. So we need to understand and be prepared in the event that that should happen within our lifetime. But anyway, we see that Assyria had been humbled, and from their exhausted state they would be humbled. Now, in contrast to all of this, the line of Jesse, up until the time David became king, Jesse was just a regular old person within the society of Israel. He did not have great possessions. He was humble. He was, I don't know if you would say in poverty, but he was in a poor state within his life. So this exaltation would be realized in the Messiah. The stem of Jesse can be referred to as the stump of Jesse. When you look at the Hebrew word, the Strong's and dictionary tells us that it can be referred to as either way. What it refers to really is that something that has been brought down low. You take a mighty tree, you cut it down to the stump, you have what remains is not a whole lot of importance. And then when you look at it from the standpoint that this is a stem of Jesse, it's the same idea. But anyway, it signifies that a tree has been come down to its stump or its roots. Jesse was the father of David, as we know, and that the Messiah was associated with Jesse and David. We ask this question, why? Why did he associate this prophecy be associated with Jesse and not David, even though we see David being referred to in other prophecies? Well, I think the association of the Messiah comes from the fact that if you take an individual from poverty in a poor state of life, and he becomes the Messiah, he is able to relate to the people that he came from. An individual that was born rich, with rich parents, power and authority, and it's all he's ever known, then he has a hard time relating to these lowly people. It's kind of like, you remember, I saw this in the Wall Street Journal many years ago, the guy that built Getty Oil. Before he let his sons serve on the board or any prominent part in his company, he made them go out and pump gas at the local gas station. And we're talking about not just once or twice, but he made them understand where their money was coming from. He had to relate to the people on the street. And so we see the same thing here. The Messiah could relate to the people on the street, whereas a mighty ruler that had never been there could not do that. So I think that's one reason why this prophecy is associated with Jesse. So the people would know that the Messiah is coming not from, he is coming from the mighty King David, but he's also coming from his father, which was of a low estate. Now, we see in Matthew chapter 1 and verse 6 this fulfillment. Jesse was the father of David the king, and David was the father of Solomon. Again, we see from Matthew's genealogy the association of Jesus with these prominent figures of Jesse and David. Now, the other statement that is made, the son of David, he says, "And when your days are fulfilled, you shall sleep with your fathers, and I will set up your seed after you." This is talking to David. "We shall proceed after Giles, and I will establish his kingdom, and he shall build a house for my name, and I will establish his throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he shall be my son. And if he commit iniquity, I will chasten him with the rod of men and the stripes of children of men. But my mercy shall not depart away from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away before you. And your house and your kingdom shall be established forever before you, and your throne shall be established forever." So when you look at 2 Samuel chapter 7, 12 through 16, you see statements made, I think, that is confusing when you try to reason it all out. And we'll look at that in just a moment. But when we look at this particular statement, we see two separate aspects of the prophecy. We see something that is immediate, that would happen within David's lifetime and lifetime of Solomon. And then we see statements made in reference to the Messiah, which is off in the future. We've talked about dual nature prophecies. Well, this is one of those that we have to try to sort out. Now, from the immediate aspects of the prophecy, we see these seven statements, or these seven ideas. David would not build his temple. His son would build the temple. The kingdom would be established. There would be a father-son relationship. Discipline would be there for sin. Love would not be removed, and rest from his enemies. Now, when we look at these seven concepts that we find within that prophecy, we see all of these being accomplished within the time of David and his son Solomon. Then we have the long-term aspects. We see that there's an eternal throne. We see that there's an everlasting kingdom. We see that there's a permanent house, a greater son, an unbreakable covenant, a divine son relationship, and a heavenly reign. And all of these are accomplished within Christ himself. Christ is exalted, spiritual kingdom, son of David. The greater son is Jesus. The unbreakable covenant being the new covenant. Divine sonship, Hebrews 1:5, the writer of Hebrews actually quotes this. And then we see the heavenly reign with Jesus on God's right hand. So let's go back to the immediate aspects and just kind of quickly run through what we see here. David would not build a temple. We see that 2 Samuel and 1 Chronicles. God explicitly denied David this task. It was an immediate directive and not a future prophecy. David would have a son who would build the house. 1 Kings 6 and verse 1 refers directly to Solomon, fulfilled within one generation. God would establish Solomon's kingdom. We See that in 2 Samuel, 1 Kings 2 and 4. Political stability during Solomon's reign and peace on every side. We see the peace beginning to happen towards at the end of David's life, and it follows all the way through into Solomon's reign. Solomon would be God's son in a covenant sense. 2 Samuel 4, 2 Samuel 7 is what we're referring back to. Psalms 89 relates this also. It would be a father-son relationship type language. However, it was conditional and it was disciplinary. So we see this within that covenant. He would be my son, just as David is my son, and as long as he is faithful to me, we will have this relationship. However, like Solomon, it actually happened in Solomon's life when he fell off into idolatry, he would be disciplined. And we see that disciplinary action happening immediately towards the end of his life, at the end of his life, when his kingdom was actually split in two. And incidentally, the idolatry, I think, led to that split, even though the idea of taxation being a burden would not be lifted, but even increased, was the catalyst to make that happen. Solomon would not be disciplined for sin. Solomon would be disciplined for sin. Unlike Saul, discipline would not mean rejection. Saul was rejected because he sinned. However, he told David, even though Solomon will sin or may sin, there would not be a rejection. The promise will continue through your house. It was fulfilled through the adversaries and divided loyalty. So whatever happened after the time of David, God said, I will still continue my promise of the coming of the Messiah through your family line. God's steadfast love would not depart. Even with Solomon's failure, the dynasty would continue. David would have rest for his enemies. 2 Samuel 8, 1 through 4. It was fulfilled during the latter part of his life. Leads into Solomon's peaceful kingdom. So these short-term promises are conditional, and as we see, they're disciplinary. The forever promises go beyond Solomon and cannot end with him. We got to remember that as we go through the next section. So the long-term prophecies, as we looked at just a few minutes ago, we see that we have an eternal Davidic throne. The throne promised to David by God would continue eternally. A throne that would never end, cannot apply to any earthly king, and its fulfillment when we see Jesus exalted at God's right hand in Acts chapter 2. A kingdom that endures forever, a kingdom that cannot be touched by the hand of man. This is not referring to Israel's national kingdom, but rather it was an everlasting dominion. And we see that fulfillment in Hebrews 12:28, when it's referred to as Christ's unshakable kingdom. A permanent Davidic line, a permanent line of David. The house that continues without extinction, culminating into a single eternal heir. And we know genealogies ended at the destruction of Jerusalem, AD 70, but we have proof that David's house would not end until the coming of the Messiah. That fulfillment, Matthew 1:1, Romans 1:3. A son greater than Solomon, one who builds a house with eternal significance, one who that is not merely a physical temple. And we see that fulfillment in Matthew 16:18, Ephesians chapter 2, when Christ said he builds a house that is spiritual. It would be an unbreakable covenant. God's steadfast love would not fail as it did with Saul. The covenant preserved despite human failure. I've made a covenant. I know your descendants are going to fall away, but even though they fail, the covenant is there and it will culminate in the Messiah. So don't worry about losing the promise because of your descendants. The language partially, a father-son relationship in its highest sense. The language partially applied to Solomon, but ultimately it was fulfilled in the Son of God when he was declared as God's son. And as we said earlier, Hebrews Hebrews 1:5 quotes this verse. The king whose reign is before God, a throne established before me, indicates heavenly rule, and the fulfillment that Christ is reigning in heaven, Revelations 3:21. So, now we come to this. This, if you downloaded the notes, you'll have this chart in those notes. That's why I encourage you to do that. If you haven't downloaded it and you want it, go to the newsletter, last page, you'll see the link to it, you'll find the notes. Now, also in these notes is the handouts that I gave you, so it's kind of nice to have it all in one package. But anyway, this is the immediate promises and the long-term prophecies that we see in this particular three or four verses here. And we have to understand, and don't forget, that it has not only is it immediate and long-term, it's one of these prophecies that tend to fall right into the category of it's confusing because I don't understand its nature. And once we understand its nature and how it's applied, then it becomes obvious. Now, kind of concluding all of this, there's 7 main points. The house was promised, a kingdom was promised, it was divine certainty, eternal duration, divine oversight, a throne was promised, and permanent establishment. That's what we see in these verses. Very solid promise of God about David's line, what's going to happen, and the coming of the Messiah, and how he is the divine God upon earth in human form. Then we see the fulfillment, Luke chapter 1:30, 33, Acts 13:23. And the Lord God shall give to him the throne of his father David, and he shall reign over the house of Jacob forever, and his kingdom there shall be no end. Now this man's seed has God, according to his promise, to raise a Savior, to Israel a Savior, Jesus, the fulfillment of this particular prophecy. Now in conclusion of all of this, we see that the humble estate of Jesus is where he came from, shows God's love for all mankind. He did not allow Jesus to be born into a wealthy, prominent, powerful family, but rather he brought him into the world as a poor individual, humble in life, where the people would listen to. Those who are exalted high in life cannot relate to those in lowliness. They say they can, but in reality they can't. God's covenant with David shows us solid aspects. I want to go back to this real quick. One of the best things, I think, in my life was spending the weekends at my grandpa's house up in Bronson. I mean, this guy had 4 acres. The house did not have an indoor bathroom. The only running water in the house was the kitchen sink, and it was cold. So, and when you went to sleep at night, and in the winter, you had at least 12 or 13 blankets on top of you. And you didn't move from that warm spot, because if you did, you would hit an ice cube. So he was in poverty, but yet it gave me the sense of what I've got now versus where we came from. It means a lot to me, what God has done to me and for me in this life. And I remember, I told you this before, he's told me, he said, boy, there's only 2 things you need in life, something to eat and to stay warm in the winter. And then he thought for a moment, and he said, maybe a 410 in case you want to go squirrel hunting. So, God's covenant with David shows us solid aspects of the kingdom of Christ, and the prophecy and genealogy are tightly woven together to identify and prove the Messiah. Now, that brings me to clarification of our last lesson. I want to look at 2 things. The first one we're going to look at is a legal and physical right to David's throne. We looked at the genealogies, and I messed those up horribly. And how Jeconiah's curse plays into this, and how it kind of works around that situation. Now, if you don't have the handouts, does everybody have one of the handouts? If you don't, then raise your hand and James or Charlie be more than happy to hand you one. Everybody got one? Okay. The curse of Jeconiah says, write you this man childless, a man that shall not prosper in his days, for no man of his seed shall prosper, sitting on the throne of David and ruling any more in Judah. This is the prophecy. Now, this man is listed in the genealogy of Matthew chapter 1. And this is the chart. I know you can't see it, but I'm going to put it up there anyway in case there's an issue, or maybe I can point to some things. But when we look at the genealogy of Luke 3 and Matthew 1, we see that they're pretty much consistent all the way down until you get to David. At this particular point, the genealogies diverge. They separate. One goes to the line of Solomon, the other one goes to his brother, Nathan. Now, these continue down until we get to Jeconiah, and I've got them in there twice. I messed up there. I'm sorry about that. But Jeconiah was the one that had the curse placed upon him. Now, it's important to understand, and I had to correct this again this morning, but Matthew chapter 1 refers to the legal, royal right to the throne. Luke chapter 3 is the biological right. Now, both of these work together all the way down until we get to Jeconiah. Both trees had both legal and the biological right. Now, the curse placed upon Jeconiah that no man from his seed would rule, sit on the throne in Judah again, that took away the biological right to do so. Still had the legal right to the throne, so to speak. Now, the problem that we inherit is this individual, Shealtiel, I think that's how you say his name. What happened here is that we have them listed in both lines, and they are both referred to as the son of Jeconiah and the son of Neri. Now, how can that be possible? Well, the next chart that we have on that list is Jeconiah's sons in their known history. Now, all the sons are listed on the left, and don't ask me to say their names because I'd butcher them. But they're identified in 1 Chronicles chapter 3 and verses 17 through 18. And what we know about them, we know that Shealtiel is the legal heir to the throne. However, he did not inherit the throne in the physical sense. All the other brothers, no rule, disappears. And the third one was the father of Zerubbabel, no throne. Now, this individual is not the Zerubbabel that we see in the genealogy. That's another individual altogether. Persian appointed leader was the next one. Even though he was appointed by the Persian king, he was not really a king. And the last three, we have no record. So what it comes down to is that the descendants of Jeconiah, there was no one that we have anywhere close to inheriting the throne. Now here comes the clincher. Why is he listed in both genealogies? Well, the thing about these people that do all this recording of the genealogies is they just simply enter the facts. They don't tell us the mechanics, if that makes any sense. They're saying, this is the way it is, this is what happened, or this is the line. But as far as how the things worked out and all these different people, well, that's not important to us because we're just simply genealogists. We take care of the people. Now, the best way that I can explain this, and I found several examples, but I just threw one out that I thought was familiar to all of us, is that whatever happened in the life of Jeconiah and the life of Neri, Shealtiel was the individual that, because of his birthright with Jeconiah, had the legal right to the throne, even though God said you will not sit upon this throne. However, whatever happened, he became the legal son of Shealtiel. Now, one example, if you look at the very bottom of that first chart, the one that's got the ancestors on it, right at the bottom, let's look at the example of Ruth and Boaz. Now, this is what you call the Levitical right of heirship. We know that Ruth was married to, who was it, Mahlon, I think? Elimelech Mahlon. That was, and he died. So she had no descendant. And according to the law of Moses, the near kinsman would raise seed up to Ruth, or in this case, Obed to Ruth. And when a son was born, he would become the legal heir to everything that belonged to his father. Even though he was the physical son of Obed, legally speaking, he was the son of Mahlon. Does that make sense? That's the way things work. The right of heirship, because of the seed of, marriage of the, or not marriage, but the association of the, I'm not sure how it all worked. The near kinsman would raise seed up through his dead brother's wife, and that individual would become the inheritor of everything that belonged to him. And from a legal standpoint, that's who he was, even though physically he belonged to someone else. So whatever happened, and we're not told what happened in the life of Jeconiah and Neri, this possibly, some way, shows us how he inherits the legal right to the biological line. Okay? Even though Obed's son, born to Ruth, was his biological father, the law of Moses did not look at it from that standpoint, but he says, you are now the son of Mahlon. You now inherit everything that he has. So that little curve in the line gives Shealtiel the legal right to the biological line of David. Does that make sense?
But you got 2 Christmases from divorced parents.
Yes. Now, there are other examples that I found, but I thought that this would be the easiest one to show how legally you can be biologically someone else's son, but when this happened, that became not important anymore, because now you become the son of this individual. Now, we know this to be acceptable in God's sight, what happened, because God had told Zerubbabel that he would become the signet of the house of Israel. So this little curve that happened here, and I think the only way I can explain it is the Levitical right of heirship through the near kinsman law, did not get rid of that curse, because now, even though he's the biological son, the law now recognizes him as the biological son of Shealtiel. It kind of cuts that part of the genealogy out of his life. If you want to find other examples, I can give you some other examples. So now he's the legal heir. And as you come down, the genealogy splits out a little bit more, and then it culminates into the family of Joseph and Mary. And we talked about how both lines says that Joseph was the legal father of Jesus. And the reason of that is that the genealogist always recognized the male of the household as the individual that they used to identify the house. So even though at the time that this was done, Mary was espoused to Joseph. Joseph was considered her husband at that time, and he is identified as the male of the house. Does that help? Okay. Now let's take a look at the next one. The scepter of authority. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh come, and to him shall the gathering of the people be. I remember saying that this happened before Shiloh come, but it happened actually during his lifetime. And we'll see that in just a moment. But Judah, the house of Judah, the line of David, would have, or he says the house of Judah would have the right of rule and authority of the nation, and it would remain with him until the coming of the Messiah. Now, the timeline was Jewish authority as it was prophesied. In the patriarchal period, it was promised. In the Davidic kingdom, under David, it was present. David ruled. He was from the house of Judah. When they were in Babylonian exile, it was the royal authority was removed, but the judicial authority was limited. In other words, they lost their throne. They didn't have a throne in Jerusalem anymore. It was taken away from them by the Babylonians. However, in captivity, they still had the judicial right to do what they needed to do from a legal sense to keep them as close as they could to adhere to the law of Moses and its teachings. Then, during the second temple era, it was the royal authority was absent, but the judicial authority was still active in the Sanhedrin. So we start to see the promise and the actual event of royal authority, of exercising that authority, was present, then it kind of gradually decreased, and then it was, as we'll see during the Roman rule, it became absent, and then the judicial authority was removed, the authority to put someone to death. Then when Christ's reign began, it was restored eternally and it was perfected. So the promise that the rule of Judah, that the scepter of Judah would remain until Shiloh comes, it remained all the way up until his death, and it was removed just before his death, and then with his resurrection and ascension into heaven, he sits upon the throne in heaven, and it has been restored, and it is now perfect. Now, the Jewish authority established their status because of the Roman conquest. Now, the Romans invaded Israel, conquered it as a nation, and they, as most conquering nations do, they think that if we can just keep the people happy to a certain extent, maintain our control over them, let them take care of internal matters to a certain degree, they'll be happy, we can keep them at peace, and we'll still have the authority and the recognition of the conquering nation, and they are now our subjects. So they've taken a lot of stuff away from them. So before 63 AD, or BC, the royal authority was limited. The judicial authority was present. In other words, they were limited as saying, we are the king and the actual rulers of our nation. That was limited to a certain extent, but they still had the judicial authority to do whatever they wanted to. If they wanted to put someone to death according to the law of Moses, they could do that. Then under Herod's rule, that royal authority was taken away from them. They said, no more. You are now subject to Rome, and Rome is going to tell you what to do. However, if you want to continue to rule your people by the law of Moses, that's fine. But when it comes up to a point that it interferes or it contradicts what Rome says that you can do, then you're not allowed to do it. So it was still there, and I'm sorry, the judicial authority was still present. I'm sorry, I misspoke. The royal authority was gone, the judicial authority, up to the point of executing death, was still present. Roman procurators, when they came, the royal authority was gone and it was restricted. The judicial authority was beginning to be restricted. Time of Christ, when he came, there was a point in the time of Christ's life that it was removed and the judicial authority was removed. And then after AD 70, when the nation was totally conquered and there was no more Israel, so to speak, law of Moses and Sanhedrin had nothing to fall back on. Everything was gone from it. All fell to Christ. So Romans conquest systematically removed the throne, the court, and then the temple. And it all occurred by or shortly after Christ's generation, after his coming. Now, I'm going to back up one. Now, I thought this was kind of interesting. I know I've read this before, but it just never really sunk in. But the Roman rule here on this chart, I don't know if it's working. The Roman rule was absent and it was removed. We see that in John chapter 18 and verse 31. And if I'm not mistaken, that is the verse in which, and according to Josephus too, he acknowledges this, that James, the brother of Jesus, was brought before the Sanhedrin for some crime that was not identified. And the Sanhedrin's ruling was he is to be stoned to death, and he was delivered to be stoned to death. And whether or not it actually happened at that time, I don't know. All I know is it says he was delivered to be stoned to death. When Rome found out about it, they said, that's it. Your authority's been taken away from you for executing people. We know that to happen. And then in verse 28 of Matthew, it's acknowledged to Rome at the trial of Jesus that we do not have the authority to put someone to death. So we see that the authority of the Sanhedrin of Judah was present, and then it declined right up until the time of Christ. And when he came, that authority was taken away from him simply because of the fact that he was to die a different death than what the law of Moses said. He was not to be stoned, and then he was to be crucified. Does that make sense to everyone? You understand thoroughly now? Okay. I want to try to clarify that because that was an important part of our last lesson. We'll begin Sunday on our next section. I think it's chapter 4, pages 51 through 55.